Used golf clubs. A privileged few will find the hands of a budding young golfer on a limited budget and make their way back out to the course. But with ever-advancing equipment technology, many of these will never hit another ball. But for some, there just might be a new kind of destiny. When I was a kid, the Buck 192 Vanguard was one of my favorite knives to admire in the outdoor catalogs. Unfortunately, it would remain out of my price range for most of my youth. At some point in my 20s, I came across a good deal on this more modern rubberized handle version, but the one that always caught my eye was the classic 192 laminated wood handle with liners on the brass guard and pommel. To me, it's just a work of art. Just so you guys know, I finally got around to buying this one, just for the making of this video. Full tang knives like this one will always be my favorite among fixed blades, not just for the way they look, but also because of greater spine strength, which lends them to a higher range of bushcraft torture testing. But if there was ever a concealed tang that I loved, it was this one. But do they have any advantages? Aside from being a considerable material cost savings to large-scale knife companies, concealed tangs do actually have one major performance advantage in their own right. Here's a hint. You won't be getting any comments like this.
I think it's a half gram heavy on the back end.
That's right. They are often lighter with improved balance. This is a point worth considering, especially if going on long trips afield. On my previous golf club knife video, I assured my viewers I would show how to make a golf club knife without having to weld on a tang. So join me now for a concealed tang golf club knife inspired by the classic Buck 192 Vanguard, and with a few surprise new improvements in our method. Since last time, I've learned to better retain and distribute the heat of my coal bed by adding a lid of fire bricks over the top. As usual, we're going to start things off by straightening out the hosel of the club head. With this design, preserving this part becomes even more important, as a portion of the hosel will make up the tang, and you will see later the fact that it's hollow will also come in handy. Let's pause briefly on the forge for a quick scientific fact check on the metal we're working with here. It is 431 stainless steel. On my previous video, I went as far as to specify it as martensitic, i.e. magnetic type, but I thought a few of you out there might be a little more curious as to specifically which one. If you have zero interest in metallurgy, no harm, feel free to scroll past the next 100 seconds or so, but if you're still with me, 431 has long been the favorite for investment casting, that is, molding as a solid piece of golf club iron heads, which were mass-produced in this way roughly from the 70s through the 80s. Often you will see 431 stamped on the heads of clubs like this one. 431, as you might have guessed, is a 400 series stainless steel, similar to 420 and 410, which are two longtime favorites in the stainless knife industry. 431 has a carbon content of usually around 0.2%, which puts it roughly between 420 and 410 in terms of hardenability, with those two having about 0.38 and 0.15% carbon respectively. Interestingly, if you were to go on somewhere like Jant's and look for a 431 billet for the purpose of knife making, well, you're not going to find, well, anything. In fact, internet research in general is not going to lead you to any breadcrumbs that would confirm that this metal is suitable for making a knife. Which leads me to my biggest point. Does this necessarily mean that this metal is unfit for knife making? Let me give you this food for thought. Many of you may have discovered that French fries are pretty good dipped in ranch dressing. But as for the other 90% of the world who thinks they should only be dipped in ketchup, good luck getting them to try it. With many things, there comes a point where the world has simply declared favorites in terms of raw materials and their uses. I personally have had very pleasing results using 431 for knives. It can be sharpened to a razor edge, which it retains well and tolerates high levels of abuse in terms of impact and torque. Now, do I think 431 is some amazing super metal that could even give the high carbon steels like 1084 a run for their money? Let's not be ridiculous, but within the world of stainless, is it good? Absolutely. And with the addition of plate quenching and cryo, you're about to see just how good. Ooh, can we do it? I think we can. Here I'm tracing the outline of the Vanguard's blade for paper templates, and as you can see, I'm going to make a few extras just in case one gets ripped or misplaced. I'm also going to go ahead here and lay out the tang. You'll see I had to slim this down a bit from the original plan in order to be able to work with what I had on the hosel portion of the club. But really no harm done, as most concealed tangs taper towards the tip anyway. With this knife, I used the spray paint trick to make the outline. I ended up retracing the outline with a Sharpie because I was a little bit worried about the overspray pooling under the edge of the template and giving me a false impression. Yeah, that looks a little better. But don't get me wrong, the paint still helps a lot from a visual standpoint and really helps the portions that I need to cut off stand out nicely. I love my angle grinder. I mean, just look at how easy that is. Yeah, there's a lot of merit in forging something to shape, and I've done that, and I'll do it again. But it's really hard to argue with how practical and efficient this tool is. Now it's time to clean up the profile and thickness a bit on the 4x36. For stock removal and anything really requiring 60 to 80 grit, I've recently upgraded to zirconia metal grinding belts rather than general use belts, as you may have noticed by the blue color. These have been great for speeding things up, and you should really give them a try if you haven't already. Just a reminder here that it is very helpful to frequently dip the workpiece in cool water so you don't burn yourself, as well as getting more life out of your sanding belts and protecting the workpiece. On that note, I want to remind everybody to keep protection over your eyes, ears, mouth, and nose, even if you're only working briefly. Now I'm hand filing the tang in the edges where the blade will meet the guard because I want to make extra sure they form perfect 90-degree angles. This is critical to get a professional looking fit between the blade and guard. Now that I'm confident my angles are correct, I can take it to the 1x30 belt sander to continue slimming down the profile down through my Sharpie lines. As I do this, I frequently refer back to the paper template to be sure I'm not taking away too much. The encircling tool rest and slim platen design of the 1x30 make it easy to reach and further define all the little aspects that couldn't be sanded on the 4x36. With the blade now fully profiled, I can now turn my attention to forging all the metal pieces, 4 to be exact, that will make up the guard and pommel. So to get started, I'm taking several caliper measurements to serve as reference as I rough out these pieces. The Vanguard has brass for its guard and pommel, and while it may be lovely straight out of the box, I'm not a huge fan of how brass starts to look with age, taking on scratches and drabby patina that look nothing like the original sparkly gold look. So I decided to make mine out of, you guessed it, 431. So overall, I ended up slicing up 2 more golf club heads to obtain pieces thick enough to make a stainless guard and pommel. For little work pieces like these, it's best to go with a small gas forge. Didn't want to be digging through the coals trying to find something the size of my little finger. Not only that, I had to make 4 of these pieces, which was tedious. So the convenience of just firing up the little paint can forge was really nice to help me get through this part. The piece I'm working on here is the one that would ultimately become the guard. If you're wondering why I have to forge it at all, rather than just cutting a chunk of club and going straight to the grinder, think about this. The shape of a club head is a wide array of curves and varied thickness. So it was necessary to squash these oddly shaped chunks into something more rectangular with even thickness across, in order to make the guard and pommel into the proper dimensions. So as you just saw, I used the belt sander to clean all four pieces up a bit after forging, and what I'm doing here is making the slot in the guard for the tang to fit through. So to get this started, I simply took it to the drill press and drilled 3 small holes in a row, which I apologize for not taking the time to video, and then I used needle files to complete the shape. The needle files had it fitting almost perfect, but I wanted more, especially since I was reminded to match the standards of the Vanguard every step of the way. So once the guard was fitting pretty well, I forged it red hot again, hammered it down a bit tighter, then basically swaged it into place while still red hot. This turned out to be a very good decision, making a perfectly flush fit between the blade and the guard. As you can see, I like to leave things very generous to allow for easy corrections, say if the slot had been a little off to one side. But with that done, I was then able to trim it roughly to length. So while I already had the angle grinder in my hands, I used it to go ahead and cut out the rough shapes of the other 3 pieces that make up the pommel and thin liner pieces. If you're wondering why I didn't show those pieces being forged, it's because it's basically the exact same process you saw me do with the guard piece, and the last thing I want to do is make you suffer through a bunch of identical footage. So the pommel piece I'm working on here definitely was the most challenging because it had to be so thick, and I had to reserve the thickest part of the sole of the golf club for it. Now I'm using a bench grinder to further rough out the shapes of the fittings, because at this point we're still removing large amounts of metal and it feels more like sculpting. It would have been very impractical to use a belt sander for this part. That's some good advice I got from Tyrell Knife Works. Bench grinders save belts, and saving belts saves you money. Speaking of saving money, it's really satisfying to turn out a nice thick hunk of stainless like this pommel piece, using repurposed metal without having to rely on some knife supply company. Okay, now I think we're ready for the belt sander. So now it's time for just a quick touch-up for all 4 fittings on the 4x36 to ensure they have flat, level mating surfaces. After this, I gave the fittings just a few figure eights by hand over some 120 grit to get them just a bit smoother. I can now explain what I meant earlier when I said there's a utility in the fact that the part of the tang that was once hosel is actually hollow. As you can see, once it was smashed flat and then ground on either side, this opened up perfect seams, dividing it into 2 equal halves, which I'm now separating. So now that I've confirmed I can wedge something between these 2 halves, I take it to the drill press and drill a small 2mm hole straight through both halves. So you might ask, what's all this fiddling we're doing with the tip of the tang? Aren't we just going to glue it up in the handle and run a pin through it? Well, that's one way to go, and nothing against knives that have that design, but one thing I believe that sets the Vanguard apart from other concealed tangs is the fact that the tang runs the full length of the handle, terminating with a threaded rod which threads into the pommel pieces. No, I didn't take my Vanguard to the emergency room and ask for an x-ray. These images were just floating around out there on Google. You gotta love the internet. To me, the innovation of this threaded rod is a really smart bit of engineering. Short of making a knife full tang, this is just about the best thing you could do to provide spine leverage against hard use, such as chopping and other bushcraft things. So to do this, as you saw, I merely took a stainless steel screw and snipped the head off, and now I'm forging it to get one end of it flattened out a bit. Don't judge my framing hammer, sometimes I just grab whatever's nearby. So once I had the end nice and flat, I proceeded to the drill press and put a nice little 2mm hole right through it. You may notice there's a second hole. That's because my first attempt was a little goofed up and off center, but no harm, I just ended up trimming that part off later. So with that done, I can now take the threaded rod and slip it between the two split halves like so, and insert a 2mm brass pin that fits through the hole we drilled. Once I have it through, I'll simply be trimming it off short and hammering a bit on each side to rivet the ends. I actually did and undid this easily 2 or 3 times just for mock-up assemblies. As you can see, the threaded shaft pivots up and down rather than being rigid, which I found to be a really good side feature, and you'll see why later on. Now I begin working on the handle. For the handle, I'm using alternating black-gray micarta, which I made using Total Boat epoxy and polyester shirts. If you're interested in seeing the full video of how I made this micarta, please check it out on my channel. So here I'm using the miter saw to cut 2 pieces to average knife scale dimensions, about 5 inches by 1.5 inches. And I use the word scales because, as you can see, I've made this micarta to a thickness that can be used as scales on full tang knives, but with the steps I'm about to show can be easily adapted to a block for a hidden tang. So once I've traced the outline of the Vanguard's handle with generous margins, I take it back to the miter saw and trim to length. Notice I've angled that painter's tape you see there to match the pitch for how much the pommel will angle down. The pieces I just trimmed off will later be used to make the liners. Here I'm just using a jigsaw and then a handsaw to finish roughing out the shape. Next I'm tracing the tang onto both pieces of micarta, and then I use my router to create a perfect cavity for the tang as well as a path for the threaded shaft to exit the pommel. As you can see, the router gives me great control over how deep I cut the cavity, with each half of the handle sharing a little of the room that's needed, which means I don't have to cut it very deep at all. So before we move forward with the handle, I'm going to take those pieces of micarta we trimmed off earlier, and using the 8-inch sanding disc I shaped them into the liners that will be on the garden pommel. Shaping the outline of these was pretty easy. The hardest part, I would say, was getting them thin enough to be liners, and that's due to these pieces being non-metal, so no magnetic holding tool. Thus it was hard to hold them up against the disc without grinding my fingertips once they started getting pretty thin. So what I ended up doing was just thinning 1/2 at a time, sometimes holding with a pair of pliers. And once these pieces were thin enough and fit onto the tang, I went back to the 8-inch disc and ground them down to their profile. As you can see with this 2/2 method, you have way more control over what's going on inside the handle, as you can cut away only what's needed to fit the tang with a constant view over what you're cutting, as opposed to blindly boring out a hole for the tang, which can have some pretty rough pitfalls, such as exposed glue or voids when grinding to shape. So here I'm just mixing up a very small batch of Total Boat, which is the same epoxy that was used to make the micarta, and then dabbing on a thin layer on the inside of each half, only putting epoxy on the mating surfaces now, nothing in the cavity yet. I then join up the 2 halves with C-clamps, and before setting aside to cure, I just do a quick test to make sure the tang and threaded shaft can fit through easily. Next time on Staggerly's Man Cave, we're going to have to heat things up before we get to the hard and cold, and we still got some hard work to do. Is this knife going to turn out like I hoped, or is the dream just going to go up in the flames? Find out on part 2, only on Staggerly's Man Cave.